Good evening, everyone. My name is Usha Venkatesh, and I'm the Interim Instructional Dean for ELAP, Linguistics and Communication Studies. It's my great honor today to welcome you all here to the Frank Islam Athenaeum Symposia Series event. This distinguished speaker series, which has been made possible through a generous gift from philanthropist and civic leader, Mr. Frank Islam, offers presentations on timely and stimulating topics delivered by today's leading experts in international affairs, social science, the humanities, arts, politics, and economics. This semester, our lineup explores the theme of culture, diffusion, and power. Each speaker will discuss elements of cross-cultural or temporal experiences, the intermingling of ideas, and the consequences, both positive and negative, of such intermingling. You can find more information about this semester's speakers by grabbing one of the bookmarks out front, by visiting the website, and by joining our mailing list. We also have an evaluation survey that was handed out to you as you entered, or that you could grab when you leave. And we encourage you to fill them out and drop them off on your way out. They help us hugely in future planning for the program. Before we begin, there are a few practical notes to share. If you are a student who may need a certificate of attendance for being here today, they will be available at the exit after the talk. For faculty and staff who may be attending and wish to receive multicultural diversity training credit, if you haven't done so already, please sign up at the entrance table after the talk. We do ask that you silence your phones and turn off all screens to avoid distractions to others. Also, there will be an opportunity for question and answers following the presentation. There are 2 microphones placed in the aisles. At the designated time, we will invite you to ask questions. And if you wish to do so, please make your way to the microphones and plan accordingly. After the talk, I invite everyone to continue the conversation in the upstairs lobby with light refreshments. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Today, we are very fortunate to have Alessandro Angelini here with us, and he will deliver a presentation titled Model Favela, Imagination and Inequality in Brazil. Dr. Angelini will recount the rise into artistic prominence of Project Morrinho, a miniature urban play world created by a youth collective in a favela or squatter settlement in Rio de Janeiro. He will explore what their iconoclastic role-playing game reveals about the status of imagination in an increasingly unequal, urbanized world. Dr. Angelini is an assistant professor of anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. He studies how building practices and cultural production shape political subjectivity in urban squatter settlements. His research in Brazil tracks how these environments become objects of material practice, technocratic knowledge, and artistic expression. His first book, Model Favela, Youth, Second Nature, and Rio de Janeiro, based on 4 years of ethnographic research, investigates the social ordering of creativity as experienced and represented by working-class Afro-Brazilian youth. Dr. Angelini has also conducted research on post-disaster community rebuilding and volunteer tourism in New Orleans' Lower Ninth Ward. He recently co-wrote a documentary film titled Owned, A Tale of Two Americas, on home ownership and the geography of race in the US. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Fellow members of the community, please help me welcome Dr. Alessandro Angelini.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Usha, for the kind and warm introduction. As you may have noticed as I arrived up here, I'm a bit hobbled with a torn Achilles tendon, but if all goes well this evening, at least I'll be able to boast that I was able to give a talk with one leg tied behind my back. So at least I have that going for me. As Usha mentioned, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and my work primarily focuses on Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And the book I'm working on, Model Favela, Youth, Second Nature in Rio de Janeiro, is an exploration of these interrelated issues that aren't usually put in the same frame. On the one side of the coin, I'm interested in what you might call the imagination of inequality, or how increasing disparities in life prospects and livelihoods become represented and made legible. And on the other side of this, I investigate what I'm calling the inequality of imagination, by which I mean how forms of representing this unequal world come into being, by whom they are produced, for whom do they matter, and with what political and social implications. So rather than read a formal paper here to you, I really wanted to let the images from my fieldwork lead the way and follow along with the narrative. As I said, my book is a work in progress, so the unpolished nature of this talk is intended actually to invite your questions and comments. So as background, it's somewhat of a banal milestone that sometime in the past few years, and for the first time in human history, the majority of people are living in cities. That we passed the 50% mark is an arbitrary point, but it signals a planetary future that is to be more urban. And more importantly, the question of what is a city and what it means to live on an urbanizing planet is becoming more salient and more urgent. So the question begs from this, what counts as a city today? The city is one of those things that you might call a concrete abstraction. A city is something that's real in the sense that we can see buildings and citizens and roads and all the things that we associate with cityness. And we can pinpoint a city on a world map or navigate through a city with our smartphones or get a feel for what a city is like in film. But a city is continually a constructed thing, both physically and in the imagination, and that's the crucial point here. Where does it end? Who and what counts as part of any given city? I want to take you first to the cultural center of London, where in 2010, the South Bank Centre, here's London if you've never seen it before, the South Bank Centre, kind of positioned here in the middle of this bend in the river, hosted a summer-long celebration of Brazilian art and culture. And there on the banks of the Thames, across from Trafalgar Square, nearly 2 million people would pass this curious installation. A miniature city, and this is kind of the announcement for the festival, but about 2 million people would pass in front of this curious installation, a miniature city made with terracotta hollow clay tile bricks, the kind you don't find so readily in the United States or the United Kingdom, but are associated with those sprawling, always in progress cities in the global south, or what used to be called the Third World. My research had originally brought me to one of Rio's 1,000 self-built settlements, or what are called locally favelas. What brought me to London, though, was the notion that the favela had, in a sense, arrived culturally on the map of what counts as quintessentially Brazilian, to go back to that, right? These kind of symbols of Brazilianness, samba, capoeira, and here's favela, right? And that's a curious historical thing that would be included in some event like this. And so and yet in Rio itself, favelas tended to be rendered invisible as green forest land on city maps. This is kind of the framing of the festival, Brazil being cast as this exotic otherness. And the total installation was these two kind of kidney bean shaped structures. So my research in Rio, however, was in this community that I call Morro do Tijolão, which, if you were to pick up a map such as this one in Rio, would not be represented. It would be rendered as invisible as green land, forest land on maps such as this. Worldwide, however, over 1 billion people live in favela-type neighborhoods, which are known by various vernacular terms such as slum, barrio, rancho, busti, bidonville, etc. There are such historical, political, and morphological differences across all these kinds of settlements that the categories that refer to them is always tenuous at best. But if you were to generalize across them, you would see that they're considered a world apart. And this world map is kind of funny. It looks like the world has some weird disease with blue pockmarks. But it's a kind of expression of urbanization as it stands in the last 80 years. So these settlements, including favelas, are considered a world apart, a type of separate reality, no-go zones for middle and upper class folk, icons of a dystopian image of an overcrowded planet, teeming masses, crime, disease, disorder, violence, poverty. But along with that, they're also considered the object of a certain kind of expertise held by architects, designers, public health officials, economists, sociologists, and anthropologists. Rio's favelas in particular live a double life, I would argue, as a social problem and potential solution. And in this kind of question, you see the way that they're discussed as a challenge and a problem, a model and a solution. These kinds of like projections into the future of what a sustainable favela might look like, a low energy type of living, and the kind of politics on the ground of how favela residents kind of push back against this idea that they are being turned into a model of some kind of new urbanism. So to follow up on that as well, in Rio, favelas come out of a particular history. They share their origins with the abolition of slavery in Brazil. The last country to abolish slavery was Brazil in 1888. And urban reforms such as this that was aimed to removing unwanted people from Rio center, which then produced the first favela in Rio. It was known as Morro da Favela, and the term favela then became generalized to be a category encompassing all such settlements. So the favela is often cited as this emblematic sign of rampant urbanization in Latin America and the global South more generally. Yet most of Rio's most iconic favelas are neither new nor disordered. They have long histories and complex political and economic ties both within and beyond. And commentators in global development studies often portray favelas as ahead of the curve of broader trends, either as a model for other cities to follow or as this foreboding image of urban crisis. So Rio in this formulation is cast as a bellwether city forecasting divergent futures for the world. So this history is not only about how favelas developed on the physical landscape at the edges of Brazilian cities, but how they shaped social scientific knowledge about the dynamics of Brazilian society. And if you were to, here's like a UN report exemplifying that. The upper image is in fact an image from Rio. And if you were to go onto Google and just do an image search for favela, what pops up is indicative of these kinds of images that are and meanings that are attached to them. So urban violence, poverty, as well as a kind of cultural vibrancy and hipness. So put bluntly, as soon as the favela was physically built, it was also invented as an object of imagination and knowledge. So the community, again, to return to the community where I lived and conducted field work for 4 years, which I call Morro do Tijolão, Big Brick Hill, home to about 3,000 inhabitants. It's a relatively obscure and seemingly nondescript community, even for people in Rio. However, its history inflects these larger debates on how the favela matters in the world, and the limits of empirical knowledge about Brazil's most highly visible invisibles. The settlement is located on a hillside between two of Rio's most affluent residential districts and lies in close proximity to the governor's palace and headquarters of the elite Special Operations Police Battalion, or BOPE, as they're known in Portuguese. In the late 1990s, Tijolão, this community, was the first favela to be occupied by BOPE in an effort to eradicate the presence of the local drug faction. It then became a case for what would later be known as a citywide public security campaign called favela pacification. This state-led strategy to occupy favelas with military police units and to extend formal legal and market regimes to these territories. BOPE uses Tijolão still today as a training ground for tactical operations in other favelas. So I would regularly see squads of 4 or 5 officers stalking through the community with their rifles raised in live exercises, since the local drug gang maintained a low profile in this community. So there was kind of a low, statistical low rate of violence, but a kind of tension about the community being used as a training ground. At the turn of the millennium, Tijolão also underwent a patchwork of architectural and infrastructural upgrading works financed by the Inter-American Development Bank, aimed at retrofitting favelas with urban hardware and public housing units such as these to soothe class segregation. And the project essentially aimed to foster formal citizenship through engineering and construction. And so in these two senses, this community was a kind of a test case, a pilot case for larger strategies, right? But Tijolão is also host to a space that defies official representations of the favela. So under this canopy of mango and jackfruit trees at the forested edge of the community stands a miniature model of Rio, of painted bricks, mortar, ceramic tiles, and myriad other found objects. This miniature city populated by thousands of tiny but lively characters. In 1997, a family moved into a modest shack that you can still see in the background there in this area from a small town deep in the interior of Rio de Janeiro state. And not knowing anyone else and struck by the contrast of affluence and poverty seemingly inscribed in this landscape of Rio, the 2 boys in this family, ages 14 and 9 at the time, used their father's masonry tools and pilfered bricks from neighbors to start representing this new reality to themselves. And as the elder son told me, my little brother would get the bricks and cut holes in them. He was inspired by the holes you would see around Tijolão made by stray bullets. He liked to look at those bullet holes and tell stories. That's the way violence became play for us, and the play became a way to escape that violence. So for these young newcomers in Rio, the bricks entered into their consciousness by, in a sense, pointing to armed conflict around them between police and drug gangs, which was made up of, after all, youth roughly of their own age. These bricks, whose technical name, again, is the structural hollow clay tiles, constitute a fundamental metonymic element of the model. That is to say, a single brick came to represent a whole house in both its appearance and its substance, right? It matters that it's made out of this particular brick. And I'll get into why that matters. The 2 brothers would be joined by peers who would build and play at this site continuously over the next 20 years. Today, my interest in the bricks actually extended. I wanted to know how the bricks mattered in everyday life. So people are constantly adding to their homes, and I was involved in home building as part of my ethnographic practice. And this house would actually be constructed, and I would rent it later. Now, the two brothers would, I also want to point out that how the materiality, the stones, the bricks that are built into the favela are ways of telling history, which I'll get into in a second as well. The two brothers would be joined by their peers, though, and play at this site continuously over the next 20 years. This miniature city would eventually be known as Morrinho, or Little Hill. And hill is kind of a slang. A morro is a slang term for favela. It's a little more value neutral. It doesn't bring the kind of negative connotations that the favela does. Favela would translate as slum with the same kind of pejorative connotations there. Their model, though, extends over about 4,000 square feet of forest floor, hugging the contours of the slope. It's inhabited by thousands of inch-tall figurines called bonecos. And here I'm showing you just what work and the care that goes into building it involved. In fact, for the first 3 years, this is all I knew about this site. I got involved in building it with them and acquired a kind of appreciation for the daily maintenance of it. So you can see how methodical this young man is being with building up the model. Now, within Morrinho, here's a different site, different snapshots of it. It's inhabited by thousands of inch-tall figurines, or what are called bonecos, which actually is my like profile picture for this talk. And here is Alex himself in the flesh or in the plastic. He's one of thousands of these inhabitants of this miniature world, and who's made of plastic bricks or blocks that you might have played with when you were a kid, and who each possess an individual name and a life history acquired through episodes of play. So the players in this game manipulate and ventriloquize their diminutive avatars with these falsetto voices and into these improvised dramas of commerce, leisure, romance, and violence, with the characters ranging from sales clerks and elderly people to drug traffickers and police officers. The teenage boys, and more recently a cohort of girls, have built the model and play a role-playing game girded by the rules of reality as they perceive it. And so in recent years, they've even given guided tours of the community and brought this project to tourists, like as I think this image shows. This image captures a lot of what happens there. On the left side of the image, you have a young man showing tourists who are off-frame the community and introducing them to the place. You have somebody else working in maintenance. You have just kids hanging out. He's also building up his part of the model. And there's younger children just also kind of there and absorbing. So all of this this creates this kind of sense of this is a social space for local children. Now, as a tableau, though, over which play unfolds, Morrinho is continuously built and maintained with this great care, using those materials used to construct the real-life homes of their creators. And that fundamental building unit is that omnipresent clay tile brick, another artifact I have for you here. The word faculdade means college, so that sits in my office as a reminder. So each of these bricks have to be chopped in half, and the windows have to be chiseled in individually. And they're easy to work with precisely because they're cheap, lightweight, fragile, and hence malleable. And I would come to acquire this tactile appreciation for them by getting involved in making the model, as well as in actual house building, as I showed before. The building materials are also a way of telling history, as I suggested before. As with the stones that proved, according to elder residents of the community, that a quilombo, or escaped slave settlement, once occupied this ground as the same ground as their community. So these bricks and stones connected people to their own history and allowed them to make claims on the past through material things. And so this game, this way of playing with one's own material, has a kind of historical legacy attached to it. The brick's shoddy quality quite suits the demands of, let me stick here, the demands of Morrinho's construction, which involves these chopping of bricks. And in fact, I came to know Morrinho through working on it, learning like an apprentice how to secure the bricks in place by hammering in wood dowels into the slope of the hill, pruning the weeds from the model, painting facades of these little houses, they're casinhas. The work was immersive and almost meditative, simultaneously sensuous and contemplative. A variety of awkward bodily movements were required particularly to the dense areas of the model. I wouldn't be able to do that with this thing today. I would have to lean on one hand with my body at a diagonal and crouch deeply. I'm getting precarious here in trying to perform this, but you can imagine like have to stretch a leg over another portion of the model and then tiptoe through these narrow alleyways, barely the width of your flip-flop. And you'd get your hands caked in dirt, and there would be music playing from tinny speakers of a cell phone to help pass the time. So much of this detailed care was required to make things look right, not only aesthetically resembling the real-life city obscured by the trees around us, but also functionally, with a mind towards the game that demanded at once these livable spaces for its diminutive inhabitants and the strategic hiding spots you would have to create where snipers could ambush your unsuspecting invaders, whether from a rival gang or police. So to become a participant, one must build one's own area of the model and to name it after a real-life place and populate it with these bonecos. Everyone involved in Morrinho is a favela resident, except for me. I mean, at the time I was. And there have never been any middle or upper class youth playing in Morrinho, just one not so young gringo anthropologist who gained entry and was allowed to play. Every mini favela had a drug gang with an internal hierarchy, and sometimes territorial power would change hands after a police raid or rival gang invasion. Some of the original group had not maintained their sections for months or years, and after several heavy rains, for example, it would crumble and decay and disappear. The more recent Morrinho regulars were expected to come at least weekly to work on these mini favelas. So upkeep was this prerequisite for playing, and it demanded this heavy investment of time and energy. And so the play itself proceeded in this improvised, anarchic manner. Imagine several Brazilian youth scrambling over the sprawling model, shouting and slang at each other all at once in squeaky cartoon voices while manipulating plastic figurines. For their kind of play is not to be followed, but to be led, and led in by all who take part in it. There was no turn-taking. So like its digital counterpart, Second Life, which is often associated with this when I give talks like this, the Morrinho game is this multiplayer, non-linear, type of game with no objective defined from outside its own internal dynamics, and with no end game for winning. So my own participation taught me that Morrinho was not just an expression of a youth imagination that glorified criminality, which is often something lodged at them, nor this homespun method for coping with violence, but it was about this continual interplay between the malleability of a reality that's out there and the constraints of producing fiction in this miniature world. And I became interested in the porosity between worlds, those of the miniature bonecos and their life-size human stewards. So playtime never had a schedule. Rather, I would often sit with the youth around this giant fruit tree that stands in the middle of the space as they tease each other with banter about sexual exploits or lack thereof, and accounts of recent actions the police were taking, and drug gangs and other favelas and community gossip, etc. So much of the chatter was about policing masculinity, in fact. It was typical stuff for Brazilian working class male youth, except for how, almost imperceptibly at first, the conversations would bleed into the affairs of the Morrinho universe. And so the discourse would shift from the real world into the play world, and then the voices would pitch up into the falsetto registers of the bonecos, and suddenly the play was erupting. So it wouldn't be long before this provocation would goad them into action, and they were crouching over a toy car and launch into a new storyline and pick up where past play session had ended. And so the participants in this drew on these everyday experiences, especially on trips to other communities and around Rio, to shape the rules of what you could play as. In effect, you can't simply do anything with your boneco that was deemed impossible or implausible. As a space of imagination that can connect small things to the big picture in unexpected ways, Morrinho was this carefully crafted sociological commentary, in essence. It represented Rio by challenging the relatively constricted ways of knowing the city and the favela. So I followed Morrinho and its stewards and as their creation traveled beyond its bounds. And I wanted to, these couple slides, I wanted to show, like I showed this for a few minutes. This is a party known as a baile, where typically thrown by drug gangs and patronized by them. And so I thought it was an exaggeration of what the reality was until they took me to an actual party that looks something like this. And so the kind of guns in the air, I mean, it is an entire spectacle of that sort, and they really hew close to a kind of fidelity to what their daily experiences are. Here's a close-up of Alex, if you can't really see him in the back. There he is. The Morrinho world has an economy as well. They use coins to represent, 1 penny equals $50, basically. There's a lot of hyperinflation going on. And this kind of back and forth tracking, as I mentioned before, between fiction, so this is a military police armored car, and reality, right? Again, the community being a training ground. So as I followed Morrinho outside the bounds of their community, it took us to the cultural centers of other cities internationally. In fact, when I first came across Morrinho in 2007, the guys were not there. They were at the Venice Biennale. They were feted as darlings of the art world at what one of the young men himself astutely described as the World Cup of art. The model, now framed as art, took on these new meanings for its creators. The new context of making replica versions of Morrinho for art exhibitions became experienced as work. And the Morrinho group members talked about it as such. Each new exhibition was described as a job. Here they are, the traveling group for Venice. And here's a little bit of what work looks like. So just a snippet there, but actually the song in the background was repeating the word trabalho, which means work. So they're consciously like, this is how what they call the exhibition gigs that they would get. What's the next job? So as a traveling artwork, it would come to stand in, though, for what the favela, how this favela speaks back to the outside world. Favela residents, by extension, are in this kind of framing, are cast as these self-reliant, resourceful, creative people within conditions of scarcity. And at that Venice Biennale, they would meet the curator, Robert Storr, who would conclude his catalog description of their work with this little quote here. That Morrinho is this paradigm of self-determination and self-transformation, an example of social sculpture, one in which the redirected lives of its authors are more than half the work. So they're being treated not as professional artists, certainly, but as kind of almost passive and naive absorbers of their surroundings who are just putting this back out as art. And this is a curious shift in the way that they enter the art world. When I accompanied Morrinho and a group of 8 of them to the 2010 London exhibition in the South Bank Center, their artwork had been framed within this celebration of Brazil as this exotic land, different from the United Kingdom and by extension different from the modern world of the global north. The favela had assumed a place within a Brazilian national repertoire of cultural forms, with Morrinho as this seemingly unthreatening representative of favela culture. And so ironic or not, signs, they would place signs on the model prohibiting children from touching or climbing on the structure that signaled that the object was now artwork, not a plaything, right? However, though, the young men themselves, here's another one of those warning signs, the artists themselves now build as artists, the young men now build as artists. They would find a way to play with that very notion of what was being asked of them and their work. The clear mandate from the exhibition curator was for them to reproduce Rio's favelas in miniature, like it was written down at the bottom there, favela from Rio de Janeiro, and they were to use these materials similar to those from their home surroundings to make it look authentic, right? So the construction in London used 4,000 of these terracotta bricks from a local building contractor in London, but was to resemble their Rio original model. The layout, those 2 kind of kidney bean-shaped hills, allowed the public to walk in between and around the 2 parts of the model. This Morrinho, though, incorporated iconic elements of its immediate environs. So one way they started to push back against that framing is they started to incorporate icons of London. So a miniature Big Ben here, a miniature London Eye, a bit subversively putting an airplane, kind of looking like something nefarious is about to happen. A miniature Thames River filled with water, a fleet of black toy taxis, etc. There's a London tunnel, tube underground subway system. So for these visitors, the familiar urban features melded with the foreignness of the materiality of these bricks, right? So that is the iconic London landmarks sat together visually with the material otherness of these terracotta bricks that pointed to this informal urbanization happening elsewhere in the global south. So more subversively, the organizers had brought Caribbean immigrant youth. Here's a St. Paul's Cathedral. So they were the Morrinho youth were put in touch with and in encounters with local youth from South London who were immigrant youth from former British colonies in the Caribbean. And this was staged as an encounter between young working class men of color, quote, discovering differences and similarities about the environments in which they live, inspiring a joint landscape. So they were going to collaborate on this. And so the collaborators from Stockwell and Brixton, these poor neighborhoods in South London, learned the methods of building and collaborated in this construction. So crucially, what they adopted the spirit of making the model and made it into a reflection of their own urban imaginary. They got it. They got what you're supposed to do with this. And one playfully painted Brickstown on the facade of one building, so Brickstown. They populated entire districts of the model with symbols of their lived reality. On the sides of buildings were the following: the postcode where they lived, SW9, the kebab shop, the halal meat shop, the Chinese food restaurant, Brixton Food and Veg, tennis shoe and cell phone retailers, and most revealingly and interestingly, the police station and prison. So these urban fixtures were selective but hardly haphazard. And one of the Stockwell youth who would come to help build a model in this festival, Brazil, explained to a journalist, quote, "I was in and out of prison at the age of 14 to about 20. It got a bit violent. It turned to guns. People were getting killed left, right, and center. I didn't want to end up dead or end up killing anyone," end quote. And another one added, quote, "We want Brixton and Stockwell not to be shown not as the evil place that it's known as." So Festival Brazil, in incorporating the favela as a sign of national culture, permitted these youth from Stockwell and Brixton to represent London's impoverished, ignored margins at the cultural center, on their own terms, rather than as loiterers, vandals, criminals, or terrorists. So Morrinho, as artwork, had acquired this utility for them as this technology for representing reality in unlikely places. It contained the openness of a language functioning on this principle of what I would call material sampling. And this is like analogous to how hip-hop uses pastiche to produce music, right? Taking bits of other parts to create new wholes. And so importantly, the experiences of traveling abroad as artists has had this reflexive effect on the original Morrinho model in Rio de Janeiro, and that's this picture. So in recent years, the youth have added geographic features that are distinctly not Rio, such as an Eiffel Tower and a Statue of Liberty and an Empire State Building. So in a sense, Morrinho has turned into this kind of psychedelic version of itself, but always hewing close to an idea that it represents a reality. It's just that that reality has changed now. It's that it's expanded for its creators to encompass other global cities that they have experienced firsthand. So the city that they know is now extended outward, out of Rio. So to conclude, Morrinho's travels animate what I term this imagination of inequality, how increasing urban inequality, how an increasingly unequal world becomes represented and made legible. It also illustrates that inverse notion of the inequality of imagination, or that question of which representations come to matter and in which context, how something like this becomes art, right? So I offer you to consider then how Morrinho is indeed this context-making thing. So I welcome any and all comments on this work. As I said, this is a work in progress, a book forthcoming. And if and there was a video I thought I could show, but I think I've actually given you enough to hopefully provoke some questions and comments. So thank you very much. Do I take my own questions? Yeah.
I don't remember if you mentioned earlier, but what year did you go to Rio for your project?
I'm sorry?
What year did you go to Rio for your project?
I spent it was 2 stints. So I was there from 2008 to 2010, and then between the World Cup and Olympics, so 2014 to the end of 2015. Yeah.
Okay. So like those areas, how do people build houses? Like do they move in, or they have to buy land? Like I saw you were building the houses earlier in one of your pictures.
Yeah, so there are many ways to define favelas or informal settlements. And the way that makes sense to me is to call them self-built housing, right? Because some of these communities are built on illegal land, but not all, so that doesn't work as a criteria. Some are of bricks, but some are built out of other materials, and so shanty town doesn't work. But this idea that it's self-built housing, it's non-professional labor, is something that comes to matter, as you can see, the way that expertise comes into the youth, into their hands, literally. Nobody is buying pre-made houses in that sense, but there is a housing market that's very important. The house I showed you being built, there's a backstory there that I could summarize very quickly, is that the man you may have seen in the picture, there are 2 men. One had acquired the rights of his neighbor to tear down his neighbor's house in order to rebuild it in brick, because it was a wooden house, one of the last wooden houses. So he acquired the rights to rebuild his neighbor's house at his own expense in exchange for the right to build on top. And a lot of these arrangements happened. So that man became a kind of micro-entrepreneur, a micro-landlord, and would end up building this housing unit above his neighbor's house that he would use as a rental unit, and I would be one of the first tenants of that house that I helped build. So you have all these kind of entanglements of families and obligations built into the building of houses. So that's the way that it matters in a sense of where, as opposed to a formal housing sector, right? And so a lot of the housing being built in Rio's favelas is going vertical, and the state is very active in kind of limiting that growth for all kinds of reasons, engineering reasons, but also kind of hemming the growth of these communities for reasons of, well, to control populations, right? So yeah, thank you.
So one last question, like outside of Rio, is there like any other countries that have like similar settings?
I would say every country, there's not this kind of architecture in the US per se, but there's informal housing around the world. I would say that I assume you live in a house built by some professional labor. We, in a sense, are the minority globally and historically in the world, right? If you think about, I like to think about it in that sense. Like we're an exception to a broader story of what housing is to humankind. This is kind of the anthropological kind of broad lens. But yeah, there are many other people studying these kind of phenomena, the question of housing in practically every country. But the global south, if you understand what I mean by the kind of former third world or developing world, is the place in the social sciences to study that. But I want to say that it's not like it just exists there.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question.
I was also trying to get a little bit of a timeline here, because in 2009 I did visit South America and Rio and was taken on a tour of a favela. And if I understand, this started in 2004, or the exhibit in London was in 2004?
So quick timeline, they started playing amongst themselves,
Right.
Those two brothers, in 1997, 98. It was completely under the radar until about, 2001, when a couple of filmmakers heard about it from their school
That was
teachers.
my follow-up question, was how were they discovered? I mean, when we toured the favela, I was told that it was very, very strongly, highly controlled by the drug gangs. And actually that it was one of the safest places in Rio because it was controlled by them, and they did not want any crime there because they didn't want the police coming in to see what was going on. And actually when there was crime that they thought came from one of the favelas, it was a problem because they didn't know which gang it was, so all the gangs were kind of up in arms. The housing that I saw, not one brick. I saw what I would call more of a shanty, with aluminum and, sheet metal that was found in various places. I'm really impressed with these young men, and so I guess these filmmakers found them. How were they discovered? Because it seemed to me that you couldn't really go into the favela unless you got permission as an outsider, because you were risking your life.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Right. So I don't know which tour of which favela you may have taken,
Right.
but this is a growing.
It was right across from the Intercontinental Hotel. They pointed out how incredible it was that, here's the Intercontinental Hotel, very high end, and then, right over there is the favela.
Right. Beautiful views of the ocean. I know where you were. Yeah. I figured it out.
Nice little shopping center there, too.
So those are the things that defy the preconceptions about many favelas. Not all of them. So like I said, there's a grand diversity of them within Rio, within the world. So some are quite developed. They even have banks and many businesses within them, shopping centers, grocery stores, et cetera. And tourism, absolutely. And well-developed housing markets. So this all defies the assumption that this is a social world apart from the rest of the world, and that they're just dormitories for working class people to work their jobs, typically as gardeners, security guards, housekeepers, et cetera. They're more than that today, especially. And I'm sure many tours show that side of it, that there is a porosity, there's a lot of traffic between the so-called formal city and informal city. In terms of what that means in safety and security on a daily basis for residents, is that they typically feel that there's a sense of normalcy with the drug gang in charge or with the police in charge, as long as there's not a change of guard, if you know what I mean. If there's not a police operation happening, which does shut down schools, which shuts down businesses, and is an immense interruption of lives, if not a threat to lives. So there's that kind of sense of temporality that can be kind of jarred at any moment. But in as far as there is a drug gang in charge, it's somebody you pass on your route out of your neighborhood, and you pass on the way in. For outsiders who are identified by their clothing or whatever markers make them look as not from there, sometimes there's an assumption that they're there to buy drugs, and so they're not necessarily seen as a threat, more as a customer to those armed actors. So this just shows that there's an immense complexity, especially at that threshold space between where the favela meets the formal city, and it can be a dangerous place to hang out, for sure. So the tourists are assiduously aware of where they take you if you were to go to Rio.
Right. I wasn't totally clear on this, what the Morrinho actually is. Is that the favela, or is...
So clarification, yes. So Morrinho is the play space.
Oh, their play city.
I call the community in which they live tijolão, which means big brick. And favelas is the category for all these communities.
Right, that I'm aware of.
Now, a lot of people leave their tours, for example, not conflating them. So I don't want anyone to leave this room having conflated them either.
Right. I mean, we were told when we went through the favela not to take any pictures, that you were like taking your life in your hands if you pulled out your camera.
Right.
Of course, my husband took some pictures anyway, because that's, we'd be camping in Yellowstone. They say there's a bear, go this way, and he would be running towards the bear to take a picture.
Right.
He took pictures of like laundry and interesting, that kind of stuff.
Right.
But
no, the camera can be seen as a threat, absolutely, to people, and there's even an ethics to photography, right? To not take pictures of strangers.
Right. You have to ask their permission.
If you imagine what it means to be toured daily, right? Some of these favelas have become quite popular, and there's a growing skepticism and fatigue of seeing that there's this flow of strangers. So if I were to, as a practical advice, if you were to go to Rio and you want to see a favela, there are favela tours offered by community residents, and that's what would be my advice, to seek out those tour operators rather than the ones, for example, that drive through in army jeeps that really feel like a safari, that don't foster an ongoing relationship with the neighborhood. Yeah. So,
thank you.
Sure.
This was most fascinating. My question is regarding the two gentlemen who started the play. Mm-hmm. Clearly, their lives have taken a different turn with their recognition, their travels. They're incorporating global symbols into their play. Mm-hmm. Have you had a chance to interview them or talk to them about how their own vision of the favela and its stories have changed and grown or just changed with this exposure?
That's a great question. The young man you're seeing here who's not so young anymore, he's 35, so it's 20 years on playing and building here. He's one of the two brothers. You saw him as a teenager earlier in the presentation. He's the one, I would say, who has really made this his life. Like, he is the artist in residence of Morrinho. And his brother had become a pretty well-known star in that baile funky music scene, an MC, a singer. So they're two talented kids, and I would argue that it needed, for something like this to come about, it needed these two outsiders from a small town coming to the big city who didn't grow up with this contrast of rich and poor as a fact of life, but who saw that it was something that needed to be commented on, and it was alienating and jarring to them. So there's that notion that it takes an outsider perspective to see something that is otherwise normalized. In the meantime, in the intervening years of the existence of Morrinho, he and his peers have become kind of these community leaders in a way. An NGO has grown up around Morrinho. It's Project Morrinho now. Started alongside the two filmmakers who kind of discovered them, as was noted before. And it came with a lot of promise that this was going to be a social project to transform their community. And it was a quite ambitious thing to project forth, because when they started playing this, they were not only not championed by their neighbors and families, they were disparaged because they were kids, they were young men who were playing in the forest, seemingly playing house. So it was not age appropriate and it was not gender appropriate what they were doing. And when police came across this model, what they were doing is also seen as a threat, that this was not just a plaything, it was a model for planning out some kind of invasions, and so they were seen as potential drug gang members. So this thing was misrecognized or recognized in a variety of ways along its life history, right? And so they instituted this NGO to kind of foster some kind of sense that they were going to transform their community through this. So it has been a part of changing the reputation of what was once known as one of the most violent favelas, and now it's known as like a cultural headquarters in some sense. But in the other sense, this wasn't created to do that either. So they don't have this capacity. If you're interested in kind of institution building, like, it wasn't founded to change a community or anything beyond itself. So they struggle with this, and you know, artists are not. It's not a lucrative line of work either. So they're constantly kind of trying to get by on grants. And to give you a kind of sense of this present situation in Brazil politically, the Ministry of Culture was just shut down by the new government. So projects like these have lost a very important patron for their existence. These are things that are putting Morrinho and other projects like it in jeopardy, because there's a evaporating sense of the value of culture. And it was a fraught idea, the culture of the favela, because it builds all kind of objectifying tendencies into it. But on the other hand, it's important for them to create a sense of themselves and a livelihood. So this is what's right now a struggle for them, especially now, if you've been following Brazilian politics. Thank you.
This has been fascinating. When I hear the word favela, I think of a place like La Perla in Puerto Rico and some of the other, your map showed that really well and was interesting. And the next thing I think of when I think of La Perla is hurricanes and it gets wiped out, but in a fairly short period of time, it's rebuilt, not obviously in the same way. This has been around for 20 years. Certainly there's been a storm in 20 years. Has it ever been destroyed totally or in part and been rebuilt? How do they deal with the elements?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because there's a story that illuminates it. For one thing, La Perla, when I visited, there's a lot of resemblances, of course, and I would find a year later after visiting that it would be the scene of Despacito's music video. So that speaks to kind of how these communities have kind of cultural cachet, right? They're seen as ignored or neglected, and then suddenly like they're cool, or they become a stage for coolness. Morrinho is often treated in that sense. Music videos have been filmed here. There's a lot of kind of cultural cachet that they are able to leverage. Yeah, in fact, the very week that the curator from London came to Morrinho to see it and to think about maybe bringing them to London, there were these torrential downpours, legendary because they would destroy houses in their favela, but also houses in entire hillsides and other favelas, and it would lead to deaths of hundreds, and would lead actually to Rio creating a smart city headquarters. So Rio is actually the city with the most ambitious, expensive smart city infrastructure in the world right now. An immense kind of system of remote sensing, and especially geared around detecting weather changes and anticipating disasters. So yeah, landslides, water, flooding is a perpetual problem. In their own little space, it happens in miniature as well, right? You have to deal with the water and the mudslides bringing down parts of the model constantly, but also jackfruit, which if you've ever seen, jackfruits are, in February, they grow to the size of watermelons, but in huge spiky watermelons. And they'll fall about 30 feet down on this thing, and it's just horrendous.
So they just rebuild.
And they just rebuild. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
So in real estate, everything's about location, and the location of this favela, that's like prime real estate with all the views and the hillside. When I squint a little bit, it looks like Santorini or something, or in LA it would be Mulholland Drive maybe with all the movie stars' homes or whatever. So is there any way the residents, I don't know if there are any government incentives or you know, something that would allow the residents to maybe upgrade their homes and not necessarily build huge mansions or anything, but just within the same footprint have something that's a more reliable, more durable, you know, higher quality residence, and then just kind of turn this around? Or is the drug culture so entrenched that they want it to stay this way? Or
thank you. That's a very excellent question because it's far-reaching in implications. One thing to start off with is that the houses of favelas on the outside, when they look, they expose brick, etc., they look like the inhabitants inside are just getting by. But when you are invited inside any of their homes, you'll see where they've invested. It's often, you know, big screen TVs, dishwasher, well, not dishwashers, but washing machines, all the kind of modern appliances that you would expect from a middle-class home, and tiling, etc., and furniture from the same stores that middle-class people would go to. So the outside of homes is just not treated usually as with such meticulous consideration as insides. So there's that question, as well as the real estate question of, you know, when I returned to this community to live there for a second stint in 2014, day one, everyone said, do you know about the French people? I said, what do you mean the French people? The top of the hill, I don't know if I can get back to that slide, but the top of the hillside had this kind of mini invasion of French speculators. They all happened to be French. They didn't know each other, but they were buying up houses for low prices for them, but for prices that residents had never seen before, so they were selling. And these houses were being turned into bed and breakfasts, hostels, and there's this kind of growing tourism sector within the community, a hospitality sector. And that was happening more broadly across Rio. In the favela that I think your previous question asker visited, I think on her tour, that favela, Vidigal, in front of the Intercontinental Hotel, or Sheraton, I believe, but had a German billionaire who made a fortune on currency exchanges live in that favela for several years with a project to single-handedly gentrify it and turn it into a Santorini kind of oceanside fishing village feel. And he was going to buy out residents from their homes for prices they had never seen before, but also prices that don't get them anything in the condominiums nearby. And he was going to turn the neighborhood into restaurants and a museum of how the neighborhood was before he arrived. So there was a lot of speculation, but that was a certain moment in Rio and Brazil's history, this kind of boom. When you probably have studied, you in global and international studies know about the BRICS. The B in the BRICS, Brazil, was one of these emerging economies, and if you know what's been happening in the last 3-4 years, you could say it's the RICS maybe, or the B is contentious now. Politically and economically, Brazil's crisis has meant that that type of speculation and entrepreneurship is really evaporated, and it has really interesting consequences. That German sold everything and left. So that's been happening as well. So it's important to kind of show that the things happening locally are in step with the macro image, the tide, ebb and flow of economies. Yeah. Thank you very much.